The parasitic symbiosis. Why progressive policy feeds the beast. It seeks to tame. Introduction. The policy paradox. For over a century, progressive movements have fought to restrain capitalism through policy, tax the rich, regulate corporations, strengthen the safety net, raise the minimum wage. These measures have been sold as steps toward justice, as ways to make capitalism behave. Yet after decades of such policies, wealth concentration has only accelerated. The top 0.1% now owns more than the bottom 90%. Corporate profits hit record highs while wages stagnate. The gap between productivity and compensation has become a chasm. This is not a failure of implementation. It is a structural inevitability. Progressive policy, applied within capitalism's logic, does not restrain capital, it optimizes it. Every reform intended to help workers becomes, in capital's hands, a new mechanism for consolidation. Every tax meant to redistribute becomes a barrier that smaller players cannot surmount. Every regulation designed to protect becomes a moat around the largest castles. This essay examines why half measures fail, and how their failure is not accidental but structurally determined by capitalism's core drive, endless accumulation through consolidation. Part 1. The logic of capital. To understand why policy fails, we must first understand what capital is and what it does. Capital is not money. Money is just a token. Capital is accumulated value deployed to extract more value. Its logic is simple and remorseless. 1. Consolidate. Larger capital absorbs smaller capital. 2. Externalize costs onto workers, communities, ecosystems, the future. 3. Capture everything. Turn every relationship, every need, every commons into a transaction. 4. Insulate itself from competition, from accountability, from the very laws meant to constrain it. This is not a conspiracy. It is a systemic imperative. Any individual capitalist who fails to consolidate, externalize, capture, and insulate will themselves be consumed by one who does. Capital has no loyalty, not to workers, not to communities, not to nations, not even to individual capitalists. It is a blind, self-replicating logic that uses whatever tools are available, including progressive policy. Part 2. How progressive policy becomes capital's tool. 2.1. Taxation, the barrier to entry. Progressive taxation is intended to redistribute wealth, but within capitalism's logic, it functions differently. Corporate taxes are not paid by capital, they are passed backward to workers, lower wages, and forward to consumers, higher prices. Large corporations have the scale to absorb, delay, and litigate tax burdens. They have the resources to hire the accountants who find the loopholes they often helped write. For small businesses, taxes are a direct cost that erodes already thin margins. For giants, they are a manageable expense, often lower as a percentage of revenue due to scale advantages. Wealth taxes intended to target the ultra-rich become, in practice, a tax on assets that must be liquidated to pay, hitting those with moderate wealth hardest. The ultra-rich don't hold liquid wealth, they hold appreciating assets, stock, real estate, art, that can be borrowed against tax-free. The wealth tax becomes a drag on the merely wealthy while the truly wealthy borrow against their holdings and die with untaxed capital gains. Result: taxation consolidates. It creates a barrier that small players cannot cross while large players treat it as a cost of doing business, one they can minimize, pass on, or use to demand further advantages. 2.2 Regulation. The moat regulation is intended to protect workers, consumers, and the environment. But regulation requires compliance, compliance requires resources, resources require scale. A factory emission standard costs the same absolute amount for a small manufacturer as for a multinational. For the small manufacturer, that cost may be fatal. For the multinational, it's a line item and an opportunity. Large corporations don't just comply with regulation, they capture it. They hire the same experts who advise regulators. They fund the studies that set the standards. They write position papers that become legislation. They create voluntary industry standards that become de facto regulations their smaller competitors cannot meet. Result: regulation becomes a moat. The castle walls get higher, and only those already inside can afford to stay. 2.3 Minimum wage. The automation accelerator. Minimum wage increases are intended to help low-income workers. But capital does not simply absorb higher labor costs, it responds. The response is predictable: automate, offshore, consolidate. A restaurant facing higher labor costs replaces servers with kiosks. A warehouse replaces workers with robots. A manufacturer moves production to a lower-wage country. A large retailer, with scale to invest in automation, gains advantage over the local shop that cannot. Result: minimum wage increases, accelerate the replacement of labor with capital. Workers who keep their jobs may earn more. Workers who lose their jobs join a larger pool of unemployed, suppressing wages elsewhere. The largest players, with capital to invest in automation, consolidate further. 2.4 Social programs, the subsidy to capital. Social programs, food assistance, housing vouchers, healthcare subsidies, are intended to support those whom the market fails. But within capitalism's logic, they become subsidies to capital. When food assistance expands, grocery chains capture the revenue. When housing vouchers increase, landlords raise rents to absorb them. When healthcare subsidies grow, insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations capture the flow. When unemployment benefits rise, employers adjust wages downward, knowing a floor exists. Result: social programs become demand-side subsidies that flow directly to capital holders. They stabilize the system, prevent revolt, and ensure that workers remain available for exploitation, all funded by taxes that fall most heavily on labor: payroll taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, while capital remains relatively insulated. 2.5 Union protection. The negotiation frame. Pro-labor laws are intended to strengthen workers' bargaining power, but unions, within capitalism, negotiate within the system, for a larger share of the value workers create, but not for a different system. This is not a criticism of unions, it's a structural observation. When unions win higher wages, capital responds with automation, offshoring, and consolidation. When unions win protections, capital responds by shifting to non-union jurisdictions or restructuring to minimize union influence. Result: even successful unionization, without structural transformation, becomes a temporary adjustment that capital eventually outflanks. Part 3. The mechanism of failure. 3.1. The scale advantage. Every progressive policy creates compliance costs. Large capital can absorb these costs. Small capital cannot. The result is consolidation. Fewer larger players controlling more of the market. This is not an accident, it is the predictable outcome of applying uniform rules to unequal players. 3.2. The capture dynamic. Every progressive policy creates regulatory complexity. Large capital can hire the experts to navigate this complexity. Small capital cannot. Large capital can influence how the complexity is written. Small capital cannot. Capture is not corruption, though corruption helps. It is the natural result of asymmetric resources applied to symmetric rules. 3.3. The substitution effect. Every progressive policy that raises the cost of labor accelerates capital substitution. Labor is replaced with machines, software, AI. The workers who remain must be more productive, which means fewer workers produce the same output. Result: capital's share of value increases, labor's share decreases. The policy intended to help workers ends up reducing their numbers and bargaining power. 3.4. The insulation spiral. Every progressive policy that taxes or regulates capital creates incentives for insulation. Capital moves offshore, restructures as pass-through entities, converts income to capital gains, borrows against assets rather than selling them. The ultra-rich don't avoid taxes through simple evasion. They avoid taxes through structural positioning, holding assets that appreciate, borrowing against them, dying with stepped-up basis. The tax code, written by and for capital, facilitates this. Result: the tax burden shifts from capital to labor. Payroll taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes, which fall heavily on workers, fund the state while capital accumulates. Part 4. The empirical record. The data confirmed this analysis. White metric, 1970, 2020. Change, top 1% wealth share, 24%, 32%, 33%, top 0.0% wealth share, 7%, 14%, plus 100%. CEO to worker pay ratio, 20.1, 351.1, 16.50%. Corporate tax share of federal revenue, 17%, 7%, 59%. Payroll tax share of federal revenue, 16%, 36%, plus 1, 25%. Union membership rate, 27%, 10%, 63%. Productivity wage gap, indexed, 100, 250. Prod, 115. Wages, divergence. Every progressive policy of the last 50 years, tax increases, later reversed, regulation, minimum wage hikes, social program expansion, union protection, has been accompanied by increased concentration, decreased labor share, and greater insulation of capital. This is not coincidence. It is structure. Part 5. The illusion of reform. The progressive faith is that capitalism can be tamed, that policy can force it to serve human needs without changing its fundamental logic. This faith misunderstands what capital is. Capital is not a machine that can be programmed to produce different outcomes. Capital is a living logic that consumes everything it touches, including the policies meant to constrain it. Every reform becomes a barrier that small capital cannot cross, a moat that protects large capital, a subsidy that flows upward, a signal that accelerates substitution, a justification for the system's legitimacy. The more reforms are passed, the more concentrated capital becomes. The more concentrated capital becomes, the more it can capture future reforms. The cycle spirals. Part 6. What would actually work? If half measures fail because they operate within capital's logic, then what works must operate outside it. 6.1. De-commodify survival. As long as survival depends on market participation, capital holds a gun to every head. De-commodification means housing as a right, not a market, healthcare as a public good, not a profit center food, and water as commons, not commodities, education as universal provision, not debt servitude. This is not social programs funded by taxing labor. It is removing these necessities from the market entirely. 6.2. Build alternative structures. As long as capital owns the means of production, it controls what gets produced and who benefits. Alternatives include worker cooperatives, ownership by those who do the work, commons, collective ownership of shared resources, mutual aid networks, reciprocal support outside markets, local production, reducing dependence on global capital chains. These don't replace the existing system overnight. They exist in its cracks, demonstrating that another way is possible, building the capacity for transformation. 6.3. Reduce the power of scale. As long as larger capital can absorb smaller capital, consolidation is inevitable. Strategies include breaking up monopolies, trust busting with teeth, public options in every sector, healthcare, banking, internet, energy, anti-monopoly enforcement that targets size itself, not just anti-competitive behavior, support for small-scale production that can't be absorbed. 6.4. Democratize investment. As long as investment decisions are made by capital holders seeking maximum return, the logic of extraction governs. Alternatives include public banking, state-owned banks serving public purposes, community investment funds, local control of local capital, sovereign wealth funds, collective ownership of collective resources, citizen dividends, direct distribution of returns from commonwealth. 6.5. Change the goal. As long as growth is the metric, extraction is the method. A different economy would measure well-being, not GDP security, not consumption resilience, not efficiency, flourishing, not accumulation. Part 7. The narrow path. None of this is easy. Capital will resist. The ultra-rich will use their immense resources to protect their position. The political system, captured by capital, will not voluntarily transform itself. This is why half measures fail and why the path is narrow. The system cannot be reformed from within because every reform becomes another tool of consolidation. The only path is to build outside while resisting capture, creating alternatives that operate on different logic, protecting them from absorption, scaling them where possible, and gradually shifting the center of gravity away from capital's orbit. This is not a policy platform, it is a direction. It requires clarity to see the structure, courage to act despite the odds, coordination to build collectively, patience to work at generational scale, faith that another world is possible. Conclusion: the self-devouring system. The original commenter saw what progressive policy advocates often miss. The system devours everything, including its own reformers. Every attempt to tame capital becomes, in capital's hands, another mechanism of consolidation. This is not an argument for despair, it is an argument for seeing clearly. When you see that half measures feed the beast, you stop feeding. You stop believing that the right tax, the right regulation, the right program will finally make capitalism behave. You recognize that the logic itself is the problem, and then you start building something else. The path is narrow, the work is hard, but the alternative, endless, half measures that accelerate the very consolidation they claim to oppose, is not a path at all. It's a treadmill, moving nowhere, while those at the top grow richer and the rest grow tired. See clearly, build differently, walk the path.